Kaiju are real. You might think I'm insane, but hear me out. Kaiju is a Japanese word for strange beast, and one group of animals fits this description very well. Dinosaurs! Their massive bones confused ancient humans, who then used them to create monsters like dragons to give shape to their fears. Even when scientists like me began studying them, we called the dinosaurs terrible lizards, and we were impressed by their uniqueness. Some dinosaurs were scaly and bigger than any known land animals ever. Others could tear through steel with a single bite, like this guy. And some even wielded weapons on their tails that could shatter bone. Dinosaurs are the strange beasts in our imagination that live as sources of terror and wonder. So that's why when Japan wanted the entire world to feel the terror of the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they chose the form of a dinosaur, Godzilla, to represent our most primal dread. Now, even though Godzilla was created with these real-life kaiju in mind, would a paleontologist like me still call him a dinosaur? That's what we're going to figure out in this video today. I'm Reisuka, the cosplaying paleontologist. Today I'm going to be evaluating the OG 54 Godzilla as if I was Kyohei Yamane himself, the paleontologist who first identified what Godzilla was in the movie. Now, if you want to see me go through all of the other versions of Godzilla and talk about their paleontology and the paleontology of the other kaijus, make sure you like and subscribe so you never miss a release. Miku miku pee! So let's dive into the classification of the 54 Godzilla. But before we start, you and I need to agree on what a dinosaur is, and you need to learn why this matters. Luckily for you, I'm a paleontologist with a PhD, so I'm going to be giving you a crash course in taxonomy so you can catch up and start thinking like a paleontologist. Taxonomy is a study of classifying living things into cohesive groups, and this helps biologists and paleontologists like me compare species and animals, plants, etc. more easily. So first, to create a taxonomic group that's valid, you need to define a set of traits that belongs to this group, and it should include all living things that belong within that group. So for example, if we define mammals as a group of living beings that can produce milk and has hair, we would include humans, dogs, cats, and coconuts in this group. Now yes, the coconut is there to annoy you, but it's also there to make you think. Doesn't it feel strange to call a coconut a mammal? There are two reasons that you're probably feeling confused right now. The first reason is that taxonomic groups are often contained inside broader groups, and they also must fit into their own criteria or set of rules and traits to be valid. In real-life taxonomy, for a living thing to belong to the subclass Mammalia or mammals, it must also belong to the broader taxonomic group Animalia or animals. Since coconuts belong to the kingdom Plantae and are plants, they can be as hairy and produce as much milk as they want, but they still can never be mammals. Now, the second reason is that only using physical characteristics as criteria for creating a taxonomic group is really one of the worst ways to define their classification. When the modern classification system was invented by Linnaeus in 1735, many groups were defined like this. Yes, they were looking at anatomy, but a lot of it was they were just kind of going with the vibes. And that's not very scientific because it's not repeatable. Of course, the Linnaean system was more robust than our silly example, and it did provide a base powerful tool for evolutionary biologists and paleontologists. But it couldn't take into account the biggest revolutions in evolutionary biology that would happen over the next century, those of evolution and genetics. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, biologists didn't need to guess if two species were more similar to each other than to a third one. They could know. Darwin's theory of evolution shows that throughout life's history, species change over time. And wherever two populations of species start to change or evolve over millions and millions of years in different directions, they become different species or evolve into different species. So if we want to figure out how closely related two species are, we need to figure out when the last time was that they were a single species. This is what we formally call the last common ancestor. Now, this new definition of how closely related species are presents us with a new problem. Evolution shows that life changes over time, and living beings are constantly gaining, losing traits, maybe even regaining them again or gaining them in a different way. So how can we tell if similar traits come from the same common ancestor or if they happen to look similar by chance and these animals are not related to each other at all. This answer came 6 years after Darwin's theory of evolution, when Gregor Mendel discovered genetics. The genome is the code that stores the instructions for determining an individual's characteristics. Now, you probably already know that we can do genetic tests to tell whether two people are closely related or from the same family. And a similar logic can be applied when we're looking at common ancestry and evolution, although it's at a much bigger scale because evolution happens to populations or large groups of living things and not to individuals. Now, since species that came from the same common ancestor would have to share a genome at some point, their genetics should be more similar than when you compare them to a species that maybe has a trait that looks similar physically but doesn't have a genome that's as similar. So the discovery of evolution and genetics gave taxonomy a new way to define groups. A valid taxonomic group must contain a last common ancestor and all of their descendants. This way, we can for sure know that all of the species within one taxonomic group are more closely related to each other than the species that are in a different taxonomic group, no matter how different they may look from other members inside their group physically. Now, this definition of a taxonomic group is often referred to as a monophyletic group, while a group that doesn't have all of the descendants of the last common ancestor or that has some misplaced species from different origins from another common ancestor is called a paraphyletic group. For example, the silly mammal group we made up earlier with humans, dogs, cats, and a coconut would be what we call a paraphyletic group. Now remember, only monophyletic groups are valid when we're talking about studying evolutionary biology and paleontology. Now, if you know me from TikTok or Reels, congratulations, because your attention span has now improved greatly for you to have gotten to this point. Now, at least here you've passed a lot of the hard science, and yes, I will be getting back to talking about the kaiju and the dinosaurs, what you really want to know about, right? So now that you know how biologists and paleontologists like me classify life, what is a dinosaur and how would you know if something is one? Dinosaurs are all animals that belong to the clade Dinosauria. If we go from the broadest to the narrowest taxonomic groups, dinosaurs first belong to the domain Eukaryota, meaning that each of their cells has a nucleus. Inside this domain, they then belong to the kingdom Animalia, which contains all of the animals. Going even further, they are from the phylum Chordata, meaning that they have a notochord along their back that later evolved into the spinal cord of the superclass Tetrapoda, which dinosaurs have as well. Basically, all vertebrate animals are chordates. So all animals in this group have a spinal cord, 4 limbs, and a skeleton. So now it gets really weird. Remember that I told you all of the dinosaurs belong to the clade Dinosauria? Well, guess which clade they are inside Tetrapoda? Exactly, the amniotes. These are the vertebrates that have structures over their embryo. Amniotes are vertebrates that have an embryo that develops in a set of protective membranes. This group includes birds, reptiles, and mammals. Depending on whether you lay eggs or not, these membranes are either going to be inside of an egg or inside of a placenta, like in mammals like us. This is the last group that we share with dinosaurs. From then on, they took a different evolutionary path. Now, the path that dinosaurs took was to evolve further into a clade that's inside amniota, the sauropsids. This is broadly kind of the same as what reptiles did, but it still includes some of their relatives that were lost to time. These animals come from an ancestor that had scales and laid eggs with a hard shell, and many of these animals, like reptiles, are still this way today. But dinosaurs weren't just any kind of reptile. They belonged in another clade inside sauropsids called Archosauria. We're getting close, I promise. We're getting so close. Basically, you can kind of think of clades like Russian dolls that just keep stacking and stacking and stacking and stacking one into the other forever. But the most important characteristic that some reptiles have that allow us to diagnose them as archosaurs is the fact that they have a hole in their skull here between their eye socket and their nostrils. You can see this very clearly in the dinosaurs and on living crocodiles and alligators, which are living archosaurs. And you can also see it in birds because they're archosaurs too. If there's one thing I want you to learn from this channel, it's that birds are living dinosaurs, okay? So all in all, archosaurs includes reptiles, pterosaurs, extinct dinosaurs and living dinosaurs, which are birds. And this is a great time to remind you that while pterosaurs and crocodiles are very closely related to the dinosaurs, they are reptiles and not dinosaurs. Birds are the only living representative we have of the dinosaurs alive today. Now finally, inside Archosauria, we can find the clade Dinosauria. Now what's new about this group is that while most Archosaur groups have their legs kind of splayed to the side of their body, dinosaurs have their legs firmly planted under their body. This is only possible because dinosaur hips evolved to be very unique. So they have a hole in their hip socket, and this allows the femurs or the main leg bones of the dinosaurs to kind of go through the hip bone. And this is what allows the dinosaurs to walk upright instead of having to have their legs splayed to the side. Of course, this is not the only trait that's unique to dinosaurs, but it is the major one that we usually use to determine whether something is a dinosaur. Dinosauria is a huge diverse group of animals, so I'll be commenting about the different traits of different groups as we go along and analyze Godzilla. So now that you know how to identify a dinosaur like a paleontologist, let's begin our analysis. In the first movie, we don't even have to guess whether Godzilla is a dinosaur. The paleontologist Kyohei Yamane was literally the first scientist that was sent to investigate the damage on Odo Island, and he already goes ahead and claims Godzilla as a dinosaur. But hold on, I can't just take his word for it. That would not be very scientific of me. I'm going to have to review his work myself. That's what we call peer review. Basically, we're double checking the work of other scientists in our field. This lets us learn more, but also lets us make sure that they're doing their job as a paleontologist or biologist, and it can even lead to like new insight because I can notice something that maybe he didn't notice, or vice versa, and maybe it leads to an idea that no one has ever thought about before. So peer review is a really good thing, guys. So first, let's check out the evidence that he was given. In Godzilla's footprint, there was a living trilobite. It had vestiges of red clay on its shell, and there was radiation contamination throughout the giant footprint. He also saw the creature and its footprints along the shore, which show 4-toed feet and a dragging tail. So let's hear his presentation, and I'm going to be commenting as he goes along.
今からおよそ200万年前、このブロントサウルスや恐竜が前世を極めた時代、学問的にはジュラ紀と言いますね。
So there's a lot to unpack here. Let's just start with the good part. Brontosaurus did live in the Jurassic, but this happened 150 million years ago. I have no idea where this 2 million years ago came from. And this date is way more recent than even the last non-avian or non-bird-like dinosaurs. So to give you some perspective, 2 million years ago, the Homo erectus, aka the already human genus, was still walking around, while the last non-avian or non-bird-like dinosaurs went extinct as far as we know around 66 million years ago. Also, the other dinosaurs he shows, which I assume are reconstructions that were made at the time for Tyrannosaurus rex and Struthiomimus, are dinosaurs that are definitely from the Cretaceous period. Yamane-san, you are not giving me much confidence about your knowledge of the geological time scale.
から次の時代白亜紀にかけて極めて稀に生息していた海生爬虫類から陸上獣類に
So I'm glad you know that the Cretaceous comes after the Jurassic, but the rest of the phrase doesn't really make much sense with our current understanding of paleontology. As I already explained way back in the taxonomy section, all vertebrates are descendants of aquatic animals, and the land animals came from fully aquatic bony fish. That's why biologists and paleontologists like me love to run around and tell people that we are all fish. Because in taxonomy, if we share a common ancestor with a group, we're always going to be a part of that group no matter how different we are. But Dr. Yamane couldn't have known about how vertebrates came out of the ocean because at this time, this was really a mystery because of Roemer's gap. So basically we had a bunch of fossils of vertebrates that were total fish with fins that couldn't walk on land, and then a bunch of skeletons, fossils of vertebrates that could fully walk on land, that were fully adapted to that lifestyle. But we had no fossils in between. So the first person to notice this gap in the fossil record was Alfred Sherwood Roemer. And so this 15 million year gap in evolution was named after him. While Roemer's gap was only formally identified in 1956, any hypotheses on how vertebrates vertebrates moved from the sea to the land over millions of years that would have been put into a Godzilla movie would have just been educated guesses. So this was a perfect time for the movie writers of the 54 Godzilla to put the fiction in science fiction. This is similar to how Interstellar sort of speculated about what black hole physics would have been like, or how Jurassic Park speculated on how we could bring the dinosaurs back to life, right? We just didn't know what was possible and what really happened in terms of evolution and biology. So a little fiction was written into the movie. So I'm going to assume that this was Yamane's working hypothesis on how vertebrates transitioned from the sea to the land and have some suspension of disbelief here.
中間型の生物であったと見て差し支えないと思われます。仮にこれを大戸島の伝説に従ってゴジラと呼称します。
Again, modern paleontology knows that there's a gap of hundreds of millions of years between the first land vertebrates and dinosaurs. Still, I already committed to accepting this as science fiction, so we're going to be moving on to the next topic. So Dr. Yamane then says that Godzilla is 50 meters tall and that he's been surviving since the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs because he's been living in basically deep underground caves all around the Odo Islands, consuming deep sea organisms. Does this hypothesis make any sense? Godzilla has no visible gills, so it's unlikely that he could breathe underwater. This, along with a lot of other traits of his anatomy, show that he's not really adapted to living a fully aquatic or underwater lifestyle. He likely would have had lungs, and like whales and dolphins, he would have then had to come up to the surface to breathe air. In the movie, the residents of Odo do have tales of seeing Godzilla in the past, so it's more likely that this animal was more semi-aquatic, meaning that it lived both in the sea and on land. But unlike what Dr. Yamane's hypothesis proposes, the evidence points more towards an animal that went from the land to the sea and not the other way around. So of all of the animals that we know of that spend all of their time in the water but can only breathe air, they basically had to come from land animals at some point, like turtles and whales. And we found a very detailed fossil record of them as land animals that then gained aquatic traits as they went into the water and evolved over millions and millions of years. And this knowledge about evolution of these aquatic traits throws a wrench in the entire idea. So if modern day Godzilla isn't an aquatic animal, then its ancestors would probably be even less well adapted to living an aquatic lifestyle. And that's including the ancestors that were around during the big KPG impact event around 66 million years ago that killed all of the non-avian or non-bird-like dinosaurs. So like turtles and whales, the ancestor of Godzilla would have needed to live in shallow water likely, or at least be able to come up to the surface to breathe air and look for food. So it would have still been impacted by the food shortages caused by the asteroid that impacted the dinosaurs. And therefore it wouldn't be able to just avoid all of these consequences caused by the big asteroid just by living in the deep sea. Also, the animals that did survive the KPG impact have two characteristics that Godzilla did not have. First of all, small-bodied animals survived well, especially scavengers or animals that were generalists, as we call them. Basically, animals that could eat a lot of different types of food. For example, there are a lot of dinosaurs that were present during the late Cretaceous of all sizes and feeding types and habitats, but the only dinosaurs who survived were birds, which had very tiny body mass compared to their larger non-avian, non-bird-like dinosaur counterpart. Our leading hypothesis for how birds survived the KPG impact is that they were very small in size, so they were easily adaptable to living in any environment, and they were also very mobile. Like, for example, they could fly and be able to reach for food in different habitats, different environments, and fly around. If food wasn't present in one place, they could go fly to another place. And the ones that survived probably were more generalists, like I said, so they were able to eat a larger variety of foods, not just one type of specific food. They also might have been able to eat foods that were not accessible to most animals. For example, birds had different kind of beaks that would allow them to eat seeds, and that might have been something that was difficult to eat for other animals, especially the large non-bird-like dinosaurs. I mean, things like seeds and insects aren't going to sustain those animals versus like a tiny bird that's more of a generalist. Of course, it's definitely much more complicated than that, and that's why paleontologists like me are still trying to figure out what really happened to the dinosaurs at the KPG boundary, but that's another story. So here's the thing, it doesn't matter how dinosaurs survived or why. At the end of the day, Godzilla is 50 meters tall. Even if he had a very, very slow metabolism, he would be much more massive than whales. And because of that, he would be much more affected by the shortage of food caused by the KPG impact than smaller animals like the birds I was talking about, small mammals, small reptiles like lizards, etc. So it sounds like Yamane's hypothesis has more holes than it does ships over in Odo. Now, since I am a scientist, I'm not just gonna rip his hypothesis apart without offering a better one. Yes, science is, to some extent, looking for all of the flaws in the hypotheses of our peers. But we're doing this not just to tear them apart for the purpose of our own ego, but to see where they can do better and we can do better so we can refine our knowledge and come up with a better explanation for what actually happened. So now, provided all of this evidence, here's my hypothesis, okay? The ancestor of Godzilla was already an animal that lived on beaches and probably swam for hunting reasons. But it wasn't as massive as the modern day Godzilla was, and it wasn't as adapted to hunting things in the deep sea. Right before the KPG impact happened, maybe their food sources started dwindling, and that sort of pushed Godzilla to gain some aquatic adaptations over millions of years of evolution. And this would allow them to feed on fish in the open seas as they got more of these aquatic adaptations. Over time, they might have been able to reach islands in the open sea and then find even more food resources both in the open sea and on those islands. And what's great is that these islands would not have even had any of the previous competitors of the Godzilla ancestors. So now that Godzilla was already semi-aquatic before the KPG extinction event happened, when the asteroid hit, they could just go ahead and travel long distances through swimming in the open ocean and reaching these islands that maybe weren't as affected by the asteroid. Maybe they could have even hopped from island to island and had a nomadic lifestyle. Who knows? Now, the mass extinction might have also pushed Godzilla's species to dive deeper. See what I did there? Like, maybe they had too many competitors on the surface of the ocean or on these islands they were hopping between, or maybe their aquatic adaptations were starting to kind of evolve too quickly so that they could no longer hunt on land. So if this was happening, Godzilla could get more and more food from the open ocean, maybe some food from the middle area of the ocean, while it's still like grabbing some snacks off of the shallow area of the islands. And if all of this happened, Godzilla might have undergone what we call deep sea gigantism. Now, deep sea gigantism is when animals that live in the deeper portion of the sea are usually a lot larger in body mass or body size than their shallow sea counterpart. And we still don't really have a solid hypothesis as to why this happens, but it happens. Over time, it's likely that Godzilla would then start to have a lifestyle that's more like similar to those of sperm whales that spend hours in 2,000 kilometer deep regions, and then they only go to the surface to breathe and give birth. Okay, but the next thing he said is super interesting.
度重なる水爆実験によって彼らの生活環境を完全に破壊され、もっと砕いて言えば、あの水爆の被害を受けたために安住の地を追い出されたと。
Now, this actually makes a lot of sense to basically explain like why Godzilla had this unprecedented rampage going on in Tokyo. Godzilla losing its natural habitat would make it an invasive species if you put it in another environment. And this causes a lot of damage because whenever you put an invasive species into another environment, of course it's going to cause a lot of damage because the organisms and the habitat around it is not adapted to deal with this thing that, you know, they have no idea what it is. They have no idea where it came from. They're not used to what it is. And that's basically what Godzilla was doing to us. In the real world, this does happen because many species are pushed out of their homes because of human intervention, construction, farming, whatever, and it basically makes it impossible for the original species to live there, so then they're pushed out. And this can be really dangerous for humans and the animal that becomes the invasive species. So for example, grizzly bears are losing a lot of the forest area that they need to live in because of climate change and because of human deforestation. So that's why it's becoming really common for grizzly bears to start looking in, human cities and human trash for food, even though they usually avoid us. They're becoming an invasive species because us and climate change has pushed them out of their natural environment. So going back to Godzilla, if we apply that same hypothesis, maybe Godzilla only moved so far inland because it was impossible for it to keep living in its natural habitat because of what the humans were doing to it. This is a great reminder that the Godzilla movie does convey the message that whenever humans mess with nature, we will pay for it dearly. So yeah, I agree with Yamane-san's conclusions on this one, but there's still a little more paleontology to discuss. Now, Dr. Yamane says that he knows Godzilla's age because he found a living trilobite in Godzilla's footprint with red clay substrate under its shell, which to him, both of these indicated that this was a Jurassic animal. Now, in a way, this analysis is super accurate as to how paleontologists figure out the age of fossils. So for example, let's say we find a fossil in a certain formation or a certain layer of sediment. If we've been able to date that sediment, or we've been able to, find out what the age is of the other fossils in that layer of sediment, essentially, we can basically tell how old that fossil is based on the sediment and or other fossils around it. So the characteristics of the sediment that a fossil is found in and the characteristics of nearby fossils are definitely things that we as paleontologists look at to determine the age of a fossil before we go into full-scale radiometric dating or other hardcore methods of dating. However, the way that he applied the fossil method was not well done. First of all, both Godzilla and the trilobite are alive. They're not fossils. What maybe gives some clues into their habitat. I can't. How can he have a trilobite and a not even dinosaur? What? What? No! No! Okay. I'm calming. Okay, so finding an assumed non-avian dinosaur alive with a trilobite, yeah, it can give us clues into their habitat and their ecology, but it's not going to tell us how old they are because they are still alive in this movie. Now, secondly, the trilobite and the soil are actually pieces of evidence against Godzilla belonging to the Jurassic period. I'm no trilobite specialist, but I know that in the over 20,000 species of trilobites that have ever been found, not one of them, not one, has ever been found in the age of the dinosaurs. Okay, they are way, way older. They lived from about 521 million years ago to about 250 million years ago. So yeah, that's before the Mesozoic, guys. Before the age of the dinosaurs, okay? And the first dinosaurs only appeared about 243 million years ago. Gap. What do you call that gap? The Godzilla gap? The red clay soil is found in Cretaceous and Jurassic deposits, but we don't really know what this red clay consists of, right? So I can't really say specifically what era it should belong to. A lot of soil looks the same, and then we have to look at it at a microscopic level to see what it's really made of. So who knows what this is made of? And again, this method of looking at nearby soil and fossils, that only works for fossils, not for figuring out what's going on with a living animal. So again, it doesn't really say much about Godzilla's age. With that being said, I still have a lot more to say about the OG-54 Godzilla, so make sure that you like and subscribe so you don't miss out on my next video where I finish telling you all about it. And remember, trilobites came before dinosaurs! Before!